The Los Angeles County Courthouse had seen its fair share of cases, some forgettable, some sensational. But today, there was a buzz in the air, the kind that settled over a courtroom when people sensed something unexpected was about to unfold. Jalen Carter stood beside the defendant's table, hands in his pockets, his posture deceptively relaxed. The 19-year-old was dressed simply, black slacks, a button-down shirt, but it wasn't his clothing that made people glance twice. It was the way he carried himself, his chin lifted just enough to project quiet confidence, not arrogance, not defiance, just certainty. Across the room, Judge William Grayson sighed, already unimpressed. He was a man who had presided over more cases than he cared to count, and in his experience, young men like Jalen were predictable, overconfident, reckless, and ultimately crushed under the weight of their own bad decisions. He adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the case file. Jalen Carter, he read aloud, letting the name hang in the air, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. His tone carried no real interest, only routine. Sounds pretty straightforward. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the young man's response. Jalen, however, remained still. He didn't fidget, didn't shift uncomfortably. He was waiting. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, was the first to break the silence. He rose smoothly from his chair, his suit impeccable, his confidence rehearsed. Your Honor, the state will demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant was caught behind the wheel of a stolen vehicle, a 2023 Audi A7 reported missing just hours before his arrest. Furthermore, Mr. Carter attempted to evade law enforcement, leading officers on a brief chase before his apprehension. Judge Grayson tapped a finger against the desk, glancing up at Jalen. Anything to say about that? Jalen tilted his head slightly, meeting the judge's gaze with an expression unreadable enough to make Grayson pause. Then, slowly, he spoke. Not yet, Your Honor. Carrington smirked, clearly viewing Jalen's silence as a sign of defeat. He turned toward the jury. The facts are simple. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He was seen fleeing the scene. The arrest was by the book. He paused, sweeping his gaze over the jurors. The defense may try to paint Mr. Carter as a victim of unfortunate circumstances, but let's be honest. What kind of innocent man runs from the police? Jalen's jaw tightened slightly, but his face remained neutral. Judge Grayson leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of him. Seems pretty clear-cut. He looked toward the defense table, where Lisa Thornton, Jalen's appointed public defender, shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Thornton? Before she could respond, Jalen placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then nodded, lowering herself back into her chair. Jalen stepped forward. Your Honor, I will be representing myself. The courtroom went still. Grayson blinked, caught off guard. You'll what? Jalen's voice didn't waver. I'll be defending myself, Your Honor. A low hum of whispers spread through the courtroom. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. Even Carrington hesitated before shaking his head, amused. This should be interesting, he muttered under his breath. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath. Mr. Carter, do you have any legal training? Jalen's lips twitched, though he didn't smile. Enough. Grayson exhaled through his nose, waving a dismissive hand. Fine, let's hear your opening statement. Jalen stepped to the center of the room. He didn't rush. He let the silence work for him. Let them feel the weight of his presence. Your Honor, he began, his tone calm, controlled. The prosecution has painted a compelling picture. A stolen car, a suspect caught fleeing, fingerprints on the wheel. It sounds simple. He turned slightly, addressing the jury now. But simplicity isn't the same as truth. A beat of silence. He took another step forward. The prosecution's entire case rests on one key piece of testimony, Officer Daniel Ruiz, who claims to have personally witnessed me behind the wheel. Jalen turned toward Carrington. That's correct, isn't it? Carrington smirked. That's right. Jalen nodded. And that testimony is written in his report? Of course. Jalen's gaze flickered toward the judge. Then I'd like to move to dismiss Officer Ruiz's testimony. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Judge Grayson frowned. On what grounds? Jalen reached into the case file that had been sitting untouched on the defense table. He pulled out a copy of the arresting officer's GPS records and held them up, because Officer Ruiz wasn't even on duty when the chase began. The murmurs grew louder. Jalen continued, his voice steady. Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's location history from that night. If his report is accurate, his GPS data should place him at the scene when he claims to have seen me driving. Jalen paused, letting the moment sink in. But I have a feeling it won't. Carrington's smirk faltered. Judge Grayson turned toward the prosecutor. Mr. Carrington. Carrington shifted, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the officer's report was filed in accordance with procedure, but it can be verified, right? Jalen cut in. It's a simple request. If the officer was where he said he was, the data will confirm it. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. Carrington hesitated. Too long. And that pause? It was everything. Grayson exhaled sharply. Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington straightened his tie. No, Your Honor. The jury noticed the shift. The gallery noticed. Most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen pressed forward. The prosecution also stated that my fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He nodded. That's true. Carrington pounced on the admission. So you admit, Jalen lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I admit my fingerprints were in the car, but does touching something make you a criminal? A few jurors exchanged glances. I was near the car earlier that evening. The doors were unlocked. I looked inside, even opened the driver's door. A dumb mistake, but not theft. I never drove it. His voice remained steady. If touching something means you stole it, then I assume everyone who's ever test-driven a car at a dealership is guilty of grand theft auto? Carrington's jaw clenched. Jalen turned to the judge. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard. I don't believe so. Jalen nodded. So we're using forensic evidence to convict me, but the person who analyzed that evidence isn't here to be questioned? He let the words settle. Interesting. The tension in the room thickened. The case was shifting. Everyone could feel it. And then Jalen dropped the final blow. Your Honor, he said, I'd like to enter into evidence the original statement from the car's owner, Mr. Raymond Whitaker. Carrington stiffened. Jalen pulled out a printed transcript and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. He was white. The room gasped. Jalen lifted his eyes. The real thief got away that night, and instead of finding him, the officers arrested the first black kid they saw. The silence was deafening. Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temple. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington clenched his jaw. No, Your Honor. Grayson looked at Jalen for a long moment before speaking the words that changed everything. Case dismissed. Jalen didn't move right away. The sound of the judge's gavel still hung in the air, but it felt distant, muffled by the weight of what had just happened. Around him, the courtroom remained suspended in a moment of disbelief. It wasn't just about the case being dismissed. It was about how it had unraveled, layer by layer, assumption by assumption, until the truth stood bare for everyone to see. Carrington's expression was locked in tight-lipped frustration, his carefully constructed case reduced to nothing more than a series of mistakes and oversights. The bailiff exchanged a glance with the stenographer, both of them quietly absorbing what they had just witnessed. Even Judge Grayson, who had entered this trial with barely concealed amusement, now sat in his chair looking far more serious than before. Jalen took a slow breath. He had prepared for this, but now that it was over, the reality of it all was beginning to settle in. He had walked into this courtroom accused of a crime he didn't commit. He had walked out as the young man who had exposed a broken system, who had made the law look itself in the mirror. But this wasn't a victory. Not really. Because if it had been someone else, someone who hadn't grown up studying the legal system, who didn't know how to dismantle a prosecution's case, would they have been able to fight back? Would they have been given the same chance? He knew the answer. As he stepped away from the defense table, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Some people watched him with something close to admiration, others with unease. But Jalen ignored them all. He was focused on only one thing, getting to the exit. Then, just as he reached the door, Judge Grayson's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Carter." Jalen stopped but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated, his fingers pressing against the edge of his desk. The weight of something unspoken passed between them before he finally said, "You should consider law school." Jalen let out a quiet breath. It wasn't a compliment, not exactly. More like an acknowledgement, one that Grayson hadn't expected to have to give. Jalen didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he pushed open the door and walked out, leaving behind a courtroom that would never forget his name. The second he stepped outside, the noise hit him like a wave. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their voices colliding into a chaotic mess of questions. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring them all. He had nothing to say. Not to them. Because this wasn't a game. It wasn't a moment for headlines or viral clips. It was his life. And just beyond the crowd, standing at the base of the courthouse steps, was the only person who mattered right now: his mother. Denise Carter had always been a woman of quiet strength. She wasn't the type to cause a scene, wasn't the type to raise her voice even when she was angry. But right now, as she watched her son approach, her arms were crossed tight over her chest, her expression unreadable. Jalen slowed, bracing himself. He had faced down a judge, a prosecutor, an entire courtroom. But this was different. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then finally, she exhaled and shook her head. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had to take a risk, Ma." Denise's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. Jalen hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until that moment. The way his mother held him, the steady presence of her heartbeat against his, it reminded him that he wasn't just a legal mind or a defendant who had just torn apart a case. He was her son. After a moment, she pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "You always were the stubborn one." Jalen smirked slightly. "Guess I get that from you." Denise shook her head but didn't argue. Instead, she reached up and smoothed a hand over his hair like she used to when he was little. "Come on," she said, nodding toward the car. "Let's go home." Jalen followed, but just before he got in, he caught a glimpse of something across the street. Judge Grayson. The older man stood by his car, arms crossed, watching. His posture was different now, less arrogant, more contemplative. There was something in his expression that Jalen couldn't quite place. Recognition, maybe. Regret. Jalen held his gaze for a moment before climbing into the car and shutting the door. The ride home was quiet at first. Denise kept her hands steady on the wheel, her lips pressed together in that way she did when she had something to say, but wasn't sure how to say it. Jalen finally broke the silence. "You mad?" She glanced at him, then sighed. I ain't mad. I'm just. She trailed off, shaking her head. You know how close that was, Jalen? Jalen nodded. Yeah, you're smart. Smarter than them, even. But don't think for a second that's enough to keep you safe. Her voice was firm, but there was something else in it, too. Fear. Jalen stared out the window, watching the city blur past. I know. Denise gripped the wheel tighter. Then tell me, what happens to the ones who don't know what you know? The ones who don't get to walk out of that courtroom? Jalen exhaled slowly. That question had been sitting in the back of his mind since the moment Grayson dismissed the case, because he knew exactly what happened to them. They got buried under bad evidence. They got silenced by a system that didn't care if it got the right person, only that it got someone. Denise glanced at him again, her voice quieter now. So what are you going to do about it? Jalen didn't answer right away. But deep down, he already knew. The courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the one defending. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. Jalen had always understood the world through rules, written and unwritten, spoken and unspoken. The law fascinated him not because it was just, but because it claimed to be. It promised fairness, but too often, it bent in favor of those who already had power. He had seen it firsthand in that courtroom, had felt it in every smirk, every condescending remark, every assumption about who he was before he ever had a chance to speak. And yet, the moment he had challenged that system, it had faltered. It had hesitated. Because the truth was, the people running it weren't invincible. They were just people. And people could be challenged. That realization stayed with him in the days following the trial. The headlines ran wild for a while. Teen dismantles case against him in stunning courtroom moment. Judge left, speechless as defendant fights back with legal expertise. Some outlets framed it like a victory, like a triumph of intelligence over injustice. Others, though, were less kind. Was this a clever defense or a manipulation of the system? Jalen ignored them all. The people who knew the truth didn't need an article to explain it. His mother knew, his friends knew, and most importantly, he knew. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. It wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about all the people who hadn't been able to fight back, who didn't have the right words at the right time, who had been buried by legal jargon, by false evidence, by a system that saw them as numbers, not names. It was time to do something about that. He spent hours at the library, pulling case files from the public records, reading through dismissed trials, overturned convictions. He found story after story of young black men who had been in his exact position but hadn't walked out free. Some of them had been given public defenders who barely fought for them. Others had been pressured into guilty pleas just to avoid longer sentences. Some had been convicted with evidence even weaker than what had been used against him. And Jalen knew, without a doubt, that if he hadn't spoken up, if he hadn't known how to fight, he would have been one of them. His mother watched him carefully during those weeks. She saw the late nights, the quiet frustration, the way he would read through legal textbooks as if searching for something, an answer, a strategy, maybe even a sense of purpose. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table, a pile of papers spread in front of him, she placed a cup of tea beside him and took a seat. You think you can fix it, don't you? She asked. Jalen exhaled, rubbing his temple. I don't know about fixing it, but I can't just walk away from it either. She nodded slowly, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. You ever hear the story about the starfish? Jalen glanced up, confused. What? There's this story, she said, leaning back. A little boy is walking along the beach, sees thousands of starfish washed up on the shore, all drying out in the sun. He starts picking them up one by one, tossing them back into the ocean. She paused. A man comes along, sees what he's doing, and tells him, Son, you can't possibly save them all. There are too many. And do you know what that little boy says? Jalen shook his head. He picks up another starfish, throws it into the waves, and says, maybe not, but I saved that one. Jalen stared at her for a moment, then looked down at the case files in front of him, one by one. Maybe he couldn't change everything. Maybe the system wouldn't break overnight. But if he could help one person, just one, then maybe that was enough to start with. He thought about law school. Judge Grayson had said it almost like a joke, a begrudging acknowledgement of the fact that Jalen had outmaneuvered them all. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Law school wasn't just a path, it was a weapon. One that, if used right, could force the system to see the people it had been ignoring. His decision was made. Jalen applied to every scholarship he could find. He reached out to professors, lawyers, even old colleagues of his mother who might be willing to write recommendations. He studied harder than ever, balancing his part-time job with hours spent preparing for the LSAT. And when the acceptance letter finally came, from Howard University no less, he held it in his hands like something sacred. His mother cried when she read it. "Your father would have been proud," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jalen swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Law school was grueling, more challenging than anything he had ever faced. The students around him were brilliant, competitive, some of them coming from families of judges and attorneys who had been in this world for generations. But Jalen had something they didn't. He had lived it. Every case study, every legal principle, it wasn't just theory to him, it was real. It was the difference between freedom and a prison sentence, between justice and being forgotten. And so, he pushed himself harder than ever. By his second year, he had already built a reputation among his classmates. Professors took notice. So did law firms. But Jalen wasn't interested in corporate law, in defending the wealthy against tax fraud or negotiating contracts for billionaires. He had a different plan. By the time he graduated, he had already interned at a nonprofit legal aid center, working on cases for those who couldn't afford proper representation. He had sat in on hearings, had watched judges dismiss cases simply because no one was there to fight back hard enough. And he knew, without a doubt, that this was exactly where he needed to be. The day he passed the bar exam, he framed the results and hung them in his mother's living room. "That's it, huh?" she said, standing beside him, arms crossed. Jalen smiled. "Not even close." She smirked, shaking her head. "Didn't think so." Within a year, he opened his own practice, small but growing. His first case wasn't a high-profile trial. It wasn't flashy or newsworthy. It was a young man, barely 18, arrested on a charge that wouldn't have stuck if he had proper representation. Jalen stood beside him in court, his suit crisp, his voice steady. When the prosecutor tried to rush through the case, Jalen stopped him with a single question. "Do you have evidence to support that claim?" The hesitation was just long enough. Jalen smirked. He had seen this play before. By the end of the hearing, the charges were dropped. Jalen shook his client's hand outside the courthouse. The young man was still in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. Jalen clapped him on the shoulder. "You just pay it forward." As the young man walked away, Jalen glanced up at the courthouse steps. For a moment, he could almost see his younger self standing there, hoodie up, hands in his pockets, waiting for a verdict. Jalen smiled. He wasn't waiting anymore. Jalen Dawson's story wasn't just about one case, one trial, or even one victory. It was about resilience, intelligence, and the power of standing up when the world expects you to sit down. From the moment he stepped into that courtroom as a defendant, he was already fighting against more than just a wrongful charge. He was battling a system designed to underestimate him. The judge saw a reckless teenager, the prosecutor saw an easy conviction. But what they failed to see was a young man who had spent years studying the very laws they thought would break him. Jalen's ability to dismantle the case against him wasn't just luck. It was the result of preparation, knowledge, and an unwavering belief that justice wasn't just for those with power. He saw the cracks in the prosecution's arguments, challenged the biased assumptions, and forced the courtroom to look at the facts instead of the prejudices that had put him there in the first place. His story proved that intelligence, when paired with courage, could shake even the most rigid institutions. But his journey didn't end when the judge dismissed his case. That moment only ignited something deeper in him, a calling to fight not just for himself, but for others. He understood that for every person like him who could stand up and argue their way to freedom, there were hundreds who couldn't. People who had been silenced, who had been wrongfully convicted, who had never been given the chance to prove their innocence. Instead of walking away from the system that nearly crushed him, Jalen chose to challenge it from the inside. He pushed himself through law school, not for prestige, but for purpose. He turned his knowledge into a weapon, not to defend the wealthy, but to protect those who had been left behind. When he opened his own practice, it wasn't about making money, it was about making change. He became the lawyer he wished he had when he first walked into that courtroom, ensuring that others wouldn't have to fight alone. The lesson from Jalen's story is clear. Knowledge is power, but action is what turns that power into change. In a world where injustice often goes unchallenged, the ability to question, to seek truth, and to refuse to accept the status quo is a form of resistance. For anyone facing obstacles, whether in the legal system or in life, Jalen's journey is a reminder that preparation, perseverance, and self-belief can defy expectations. It teaches us that the labels of society places on us, whether based on race, background, or circumstance, do not define who we are. What defines us is how we choose to respond to those challenges. So the next time you're faced with injustice, whether big or small, ask yourself, are you willing to challenge it? Are you willing to learn, to prepare, and to stand your ground? Because as Jalen proved, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be silent. That's it for today's video. We hope that you enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating powerful, meaningful content that inspires and uplifts.